I am Genevese by birth, and my family is one of the most distinguished in that republic. My ancestors had served for many years as counselors and magistrates, and my father had held several public offices with honor and a good name. Everyone who knew him respected him for his integrity and his tireless attention to public affairs. He spent his younger years wholly occupied with the business of his country, and it was not until later in life that he thought of marrying and giving the state sons who might carry his name and his virtues down to future generations. Since the circumstances of his marriage say a great deal about his character, I cannot help setting them down here. One of his closest friends was a merchant named Beaufort, who fell, through a series of misfortunes, from a flourishing position into poverty. Beaufort was a proud man, unbending in temperament, and he could not bear to go on living in poverty and obscurity in the same city where he had once been known for his rank and his wealth. So, having paid off his debts in the most honorable way he could, he withdrew to the town of Lucerne, where he lived unknown, in real hardship. My father loved Beaufort with true and deep friendship, and was grieved to see him retreat under such unhappy circumstances. He missed his company, too, and resolved to seek him out, hoping to persuade him to start again in the world with his help and his credit. But Beaufort had taken real care to hide himself, and it was 10 months before my father discovered where he had gone. Overjoyed at the news, he hurried to the house, a modest place on a poor street near the River Reuss. But when he stepped inside, only misery and despair greeted him. Beaufort had managed to save only a small sum from the wreck of his fortune, just enough to support him for a few months, during which time he had hoped to find some respectable position in a merchant's house. But that time passed in idleness. His grief only grew deeper and more bitter the longer he had to sit with it, until at the end of 3 months it had taken such hold of him that he lay ill in bed, unable to do anything at all. His daughter nursed him with the greatest tenderness, but watched in despair as their little fund of money dwindled away, with no other means of support in sight. Caroline Beaufort, though, was a woman of uncommon strength, and her courage rose to meet her hardship. She took in plain sewing, she plaited straw, and by every means she could find, she managed to earn barely enough to keep them both alive. Months passed this way. Her father grew worse. Her time was taken up more and more with caring for him. Their means of living dwindled further still, and in the 10th month her father died in her arms, leaving her an orphan and penniless. This last blow overwhelmed her, and she was kneeling by Beaufort's coffin, weeping bitterly, when my father entered the room. He came to the poor girl like a guardian spirit, and she placed herself entirely in his care. After her father's burial, he brought her to Geneva and placed her under the protection of a relative. 2 years later, Caroline became his wife. When my father became a husband and a father in turn, he found his time so filled by the duties of his new life that he gave up many of his public offices and devoted himself instead to raising his children. I was the eldest of these, and the one destined to carry on his work. No child ever had more devoted parents than I did. My health and my growth were their constant care, especially since for several years I remained their only child. But before I go on with my story, I must set down an event that took place when I was 4 years old. My father had a sister he loved dearly, who had married early in life an Italian gentleman. Soon after the marriage, she had gone with her husband to live in his native country, and for some years afterward, my father had very little contact with her. Around the time I am describing,
she died, and a few months later, my father received a letter from her husband, telling him of his plan to remarry an Italian lady, and asking my father to take charge of the infant Elizabeth, his late wife's only child. "It is my wish," he wrote, "that you should think of her as your own daughter and raise her as such. Her mother's fortune is secured to her, and I will send you the documents proving it. Consider this proposal and decide whether you would rather raise your niece yourself or see her raised by a stepmother."
My father did not hesitate. He set out for Italy at once, meaning to bring the little Elizabeth back with him to her new home. I have often heard my mother say that she was, at that time, the most beautiful child she had ever seen, and that even then she showed signs of a gentle and loving nature. These qualities, along with a wish to draw the bonds of our family as close as possible, led my mother to decide that Elizabeth should one day be my wife, a plan she never once had cause to regret. From that time on, Elizabeth Lavenza became my playmate, and as we grew older, my closest friend. She was easy-tempered and good-natured, yet lively and playful as a summer breeze. Though full of energy, her feelings ran strong and deep, and her nature was uncommonly affectionate. No one loved freedom more than she did, and yet no one submitted with more grace to whatever restraint or difficulty came her way. Her imagination was rich, and yet she could apply herself with real discipline. Her looks matched her mind. Her hazel eyes, lively as a bird's, held a softness that drew people to her. Her figure was light and airy, and though she could bear real hardship, she seemed the most delicate creature in the world. I admired her mind and her imagination, and I loved caring for her, the way one cares for something precious and fragile. I have never seen so much grace, of body and of spirit both, joined to so little vanity. Everyone adored Elizabeth. If the servants ever wanted something, it was always through her that they asked. We knew nothing of quarrels or disagreement between us. Though our characters were quite different, there was a kind of harmony even in that difference. I was calmer and more given to reflection than she was, though my temper, once set, was less easily moved. My attention could hold longer than hers, but hers, while it lasted, was never as intense. I loved to investigate the facts of the real world. She loved to chase the airy inventions of the poets. To me, the world was a mystery I wanted to uncover. To her, it was an empty space she longed to fill with creations of her own. My younger brothers were considerably younger than I was, so I found a friend instead among my schoolmates who more than made up for it. Henry Clerval was the son of a Geneva merchant and a close friend of my father's. He was a boy of remarkable talent and imagination. I remember that at 9 years old, he wrote a fairy tale that delighted and amazed every one of his friends. His favorite reading was books of chivalry and romance, and when we were very young, we used to act out plays he wrote based on those same books, with heroes like Orlando, Robin Hood, Amadis, and St. George. No childhood could have passed more happily than mine. My parents were indulgent, my companions were kind, and our studies were never forced on us. There was always some purpose set before us that made us eager to pursue them. It was this, and not competition with one another, that spurred us to apply ourselves. Elizabeth was never pushed to draw so that she might outdo her friends, but only because she wanted to please her aunt by capturing some favorite scene with her own hand. We learned Latin and English so that we might read the great works written in those languages. And far from being made to hate our studies through punishment, we came to love applying ourselves.
The very things that would have felt like labor to other children felt like play to us. We may not have read as many books or learned languages as quickly as children raised under stricter methods, but what we learned stayed with us all the more deeply for it.
When I describe our little household, I include Henry Clerval in it, since he was constantly with us. He went to school with me and usually spent his afternoons at our house, since he was an only child with no companions of his own, and his father was glad to see him find friends under our roof. We were never entirely happy when Clerval was not there. I find real pleasure in dwelling on these memories of childhood, before misfortune had touched my mind and turned its bright hopes of wide usefulness into narrow and gloomy reflection on myself alone. But in painting this picture of my early days, I must not leave out the events that led, step by quiet step, to the sorrow that came after. For when I try to account for the birth of the passion that later ruled my whole fate, I find it rising like a mountain stream from small and almost forgotten sources, swelling as it went, until it became the flood that has swept away everything I once hoped for and loved. Natural philosophy is the force that has shaped my destiny. And so I want, in telling this story, to set down the facts that led me toward that science. When I was 13, we all went on a pleasure trip to the baths near Thronen, and bad weather kept us confined for a day at the inn. There I happened to find a volume of the works of Cornelius Agrippa. I opened it with no real interest, but the theories he tried to prove and the astonishing facts he described soon turned my indifference into enthusiasm. A new light seemed to dawn on my mind, and bursting with excitement, I told my father what I had found. I cannot help noting here how many chances teachers have to guide their students toward useful knowledge, and how often they let those chances pass entirely by. My father glanced carelessly at the title page of my book and said, Cornelius Agrippa. My dear Victor, don't waste your time on this. It's sad rubbish. If, instead of that remark, my father had taken the trouble to explain that Agrippa's principles had been thoroughly discredited and that a modern system of science had taken their place, one with far greater power, since the old powers were imaginary while the new ones were real and practical, I would certainly have set Agrippa aside, and with my imagination already stirred, I would probably have turned instead to the more reasonable science of chemistry that has come from modern discovery. It is even possible that the whole train of my thoughts would never have received the fatal push that led to my ruin. But my father's careless glance at my book gave me no reason to think he actually knew what was in it, and I went on reading with the greatest hunger. When we returned home, my first task was to get hold of this author's complete works, and after that, those of Paracelsus and Albertus Magnus. I read and studied the wild imaginings of these writers with real delight. They seemed to me treasures known to almost no one but myself. And though I often wanted to share these secret discoveries with my father, his offhand dismissal of my beloved Agrippa always held me back. I told Elizabeth about them instead, under a promise of strict secrecy, but she took no interest in the subject, and I was left to pursue my studies alone. It may seem strange that a disciple of Albertus Magnus should turn up in the 18th century, but our family had no real scientific bent, and I had not attended any of the lectures given in the schools of Geneva. My imagination, then, was left undisturbed by reality, and I threw myself with great diligence into the search for the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life. The elixir held my attention most completely. Wealth mattered little to me, but what glory would come if I could banish disease from the human body and make a person immune to anything but a violent death? Nor were these my only dreams.
The raising of ghosts and spirits was another promise my favorite authors made freely, and I sought eagerly to fulfill it. When my attempts always failed, I blamed my own inexperience and error rather than any lack of skill in my teachers. Even the natural events that happen every day in front of us did not escape my attention. Distillation and the strange effects of steam, processes my favorite authors knew nothing about, filled me with wonder. But my greatest astonishment came from some experiments with an air pump, which I once saw performed by a gentleman we used to visit. The ignorance of these early philosophers on such matters slowly wore away my confidence in them, but I could not set them aside entirely until some other system had taken their place in my mind. When I was about 15, we had retired to our house near Bellerive, when we witnessed a violent and terrible thunderstorm. It rolled in from behind the mountains of the Jura, and the thunder burst all at once with frightening force from every direction in the sky. I stood watching its progress the whole time it lasted, with curiosity and delight. As I stood in the doorway, I suddenly saw a stream of fire burst from an old, beautiful oak tree standing about 20 yards from our house. And as soon as the blinding light faded, the tree itself was gone, and nothing remained but a shattered stump. When we went to look at it the next morning, we found the tree destroyed in the strangest way, not splintered by the blast, but reduced entirely to thin ribbons of wood. I had never seen anything so completely destroyed. The sight of that ruined tree filled me with the greatest astonishment, and I asked my father eagerly about the nature and origin of thunder and lightning. He answered simply, "Electricity," and went on to describe the many effects of that force. He built a small electrical machine and showed me a few experiments with it, and he even made a kite fitted with a wire and a string that drew that same power down from the clouds. This last stroke finished off Cornelius Agrippa, Albertus Magnus, and Paracelsus, who had ruled my imagination for so long. And yet, for some reason, I felt no real desire to take up the study of any modern system in their place, and one particular circumstance helped keep me from it. My father expressed a wish that I attend a course of lectures on natural philosophy, and I agreed happily. But some accident kept me from attending until the course was nearly finished, so that the one lecture I did hear, being one of the last, was entirely beyond my understanding. The professor spoke fluently of potassium and boron, of sulfates and oxides, terms that meant nothing at all to me, and I came away disgusted with the whole science of natural philosophy, though I still read Pliny and Buffon with real pleasure, authors I considered nearly as interesting and useful as any other. My studies at that age were mostly mathematics, along with most of the subjects that branch from it. I was also busy learning languages. Latin was already familiar to me, and I had begun reading some of the simpler Greek authors without a dictionary. I also had a full command of English and German. Such was the state of my accomplishments at 17, and you can imagine that my hours were fully taken up in acquiring and maintaining this range of learning. Another task fell to me as well when I became tutor to my younger brothers. Ernest was 6 years younger than I was, and my main pupil. He had been sickly since infancy, and Elizabeth and I had been his constant nurses through it. His temperament was gentle, but he had no patience for serious study. William, the youngest of us, was still an infant, and the most beautiful little boy in the world, with lively blue eyes, dimpled cheeks, and a way about him that won everyone's affection. Such was our family circle, from which care and pain seemed forever banished. My father guided our studies, and my mother shared in all our pleasures. Neither of us held any advantage over the other. No one among us ever spoke a word of command. Mutual affection led each of us to comply gladly with the smallest wish of the others. When I reached the age of 17, my parents decided I should become a student at the University of Ingolstadt. I had studied until then in the schools of Geneva, but my father felt it was necessary to complete my education, that I become familiar with customs beyond those of my own country. My departure was fixed for an early date, but before the appointed day could arrive, the first real misfortune of my life took place. An omen, as it were, of all the sorrow to come.
Elizabeth had caught scarlet fever, though her illness was not severe, and she recovered quickly. During her confinement, many arguments had been made to keep my mother from attending to her. She had at first given in to our pleading, but once she heard that her favorite was on the mend, she could no longer keep herself away, and went into her room long before the danger of infection had truly passed. The consequences of that kindness were fatal. On the third day, my mother fell ill herself. Her fever turned severe, and the looks on the faces of those attending her told us to expect the worst. Even on her deathbed, this remarkable woman did not lose her courage or her warmth. She joined Elizabeth's hand with mine. "My children," she said, "my greatest hope for your future happiness rested on the thought of your marriage to one another. That hope will now be your father's comfort. Elizabeth, my love, you must take my place with your younger cousins. It grieves me to be taken from you. Happy as I have been, and loved as I have been, is it not hard to leave you all behind? But these are not thoughts that suit me now. I will try to give myself up cheerfully to death, and I will allow myself to hope that I may meet you again in another world." She died calmly, and even in death her face still showed love. I will not try to describe the grief of those whose dearest bonds are torn away by that most irreparable loss, the emptiness that opens in the soul, the despair written on every face. It takes so long for the mind to accept that someone we saw every day, whose very existence felt like part of our own, could be gone forever, that the light in a beloved eye could be put out, that a voice so familiar and so dear could fall silent, never to be heard again. These are the thoughts of the first days. It is only once time proves the loss is real that grief's true bitterness begins. And yet whose life has that cruel hand never touched? Why should I describe a sorrow that everyone has felt and everyone must feel? The time comes at last when grief is a kind of indulgence rather than a necessity, and the smile that returns to the lips, though it might seem almost like a betrayal, is not driven away. My mother was dead, but we still had duties left to carry out. We had to go on with the rest of our lives and count ourselves fortunate for every person that cruelty had not yet taken from us. My journey to Ingolstadt, delayed by these events, was now set once more. I asked my father for a few more weeks, which he granted. That time passed sadly. My mother's death and my approaching departure weighed on all our spirits. But Elizabeth worked hard to bring back some cheer to our little circle. Since her aunt's death, her mind had gained a new strength and steadiness. She resolved to carry out her duties as faithfully as she could, and felt that the most pressing of them now was to see to the happiness of her uncle and her cousins. She comforted me, entertained my father, taught my brothers, and I never found her more captivating than in that season, when she was so constantly given over to the happiness of others, and so entirely forgetful of her own. The day of my departure finally came. I had already said goodbye to all my friends, except Clerval, who spent that last evening with us. He grieved bitterly that he could not come with me, but his father would not be persuaded to part with him. He meant for Henry to become his partner in business, in keeping with his favorite belief that learning was of no real use in ordinary commerce. Henry had a fine and cultivated mind. He had no wish to be idle, and was glad enough to become his father's partner, but he also believed a man could be a good tradesman and still possess a well-formed mind. We sat up late that night, listening to his complaints and making small plans for the future. Early the next morning, I set out. Elizabeth's eyes were full of tears, partly from sorrow at my leaving, and partly because she remembered that the very same journey had been planned 3 months earlier, when a mother's blessing would have gone with me. I climbed into the carriage that was to carry me away, and gave myself up to the most melancholy thoughts. I, who had always been surrounded by loving companions, endlessly occupied in trying to bring each other pleasure, was now, for the first time, alone.